All right, we're live. Welcome everyone to Graphql FM. It's been a while. I think it's been something like 2 weeks, but we've got an awesome guest today. First, Tony, how are you doing?
Doing well. Holding up. Still here. Happy to be here.
Awesome. I'm glad you're here.
Mark, how are you?
I'm good. I'm good. Looking forward to the holidays, to be honest, but I'm good.
Yeah. Who isn't?
Yeah. This week we've got Shruti Kapoor from PayPal joining us. I'm super excited about this episode, not only for the amazing dev jokes Shruti has, but also for her amazing knowledge of GraphQL in general. So Shruti, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm super excited to be
Yeah,
here.
it's going to be fun. Do you want to kind of describe where, kind of like what you're doing at work, and just in general?
Yeah, sure. So I'm working at PayPal as a software engineer. I've been at PayPal for about 3 years now. I've been working with GraphQL ever since I started PayPal. Now I'm on the checkout team. So that is the team that when you click a button, some loader happens and then something else happens. So that whole thing I'm working on.
Awesome. And is that, are you using GraphQL a lot for PayPal's checkout? I know there's a few blog articles out there about this.
Yeah. PayPal's checkout is a heavy user of GraphQL.
Awesome. So today's episode, as the title says here, we're going to start about talking about GraphQL misconceptions, because you have this, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you have a blog post that highlighted kind of like the most common ones.
Yep, that's right.
So I'm going to post that in chat. And yeah, like let's just get started with some of the most common myths you've seen out there. I've seen a ton as well. Tony and I have chatted about that as well a lot.
Yes.
So we're excited. Is there one in particular you think is the top one biggest misconception?
I really like this one, which is GraphQL only works with graph-like structures. And I think especially like when people are getting started with GraphQL, there's a lot of like, oh, like it's GraphQL, so like the data has to be in a graph structure. And I think it's a very common misconception. What do you guys think of this?
Yeah, I could definitely see that. I don't know. Yeah, because you don't need to have a graph. It works well when you have a graph and you model that as a graph, but it's definitely not a requirement. You can just like say, I want to choose these parts of the response, and
yeah, totally.
Yeah.
And like I think initially, like I've seen this misconception so much, and like now, like the graph database versus GraphQL thing is one that
yes,
people confuse a lot as well. And there are graph databases that use GraphQL now, so that's even more confusing. But yeah, like you can totally like make a query or build a schema for things that are not necessarily like the typical graph and more just like normal data.
yeah.
I think when we think of like graph, for me, what helped was thinking of, when we think of GraphQL, what helped was thinking of data's relation. So for example, if I have like a user may have like a credit card or like a first name and last name and like shipping address and billing address. So thinking of like how one type of data relates with another type of data kind of helped me think of my graph that I would be using in GraphQL. So like navigating down the node structure that way.
Yeah.
It
I think it is helpful to think. The one thing that was most revolutionary to me was like thinking about modeling stuff in a graph, even though you don't have to. But like, say you have like a user and another user, and they're the same type, but they have a relationship like friend or something. You can create another type that's a edge that connects the nodes. And I hadn't really considered that before jumping into GraphQL, so I thought it was a helpful aid. To think that way, especially if your data is relational, but it doesn't. I don't think it has to be. Mark, I think you've worked in APIs that are GraphQL, but not necessarily. Like, had you like wrapped like a REST API before with GraphQL?
Kinda. We actually did kind of the opposite, which is really weird. At GitHub we did the opposite, where we had REST endpoints basically have a static GraphQL query. So like, a REST endpoint was
Yeah,
So you're
basically
calling REST,
yeah we're
but it calls GraphQL.
yeah
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
that was to support because like we have both the REST API and the GraphQL API, and we support
Yeah.
both. So certain REST endpoints call a static GraphQL query to kind of like build their payload, and that's done like in memory in the same process. It's not actually calling a GraphQL service. It's just calling like the GraphQL execute function.
Interesting.
But
Okay.
I've never actually done the opposite, which is much more common than what I'm describing.
I feel so on that actually, I was thinking when I was browsing the GitHub's GraphQL API, and I saw that there is the REST API is also supported, and then there's GraphQL also support. And I was thinking like, how do you guys maintain both of them? Do you like separately maintain REST and separately maintain GraphQL, or is it like one transpiles into another one? But yeah, that's really interesting to hear that REST is converted into GraphQL.
Yeah, not everything does this, and honestly, it doesn't work it doesn't always work super well, just because like in REST or other API styles, you often have the opportunity to do something super optimized, like you know what data you need to return. So sometimes transferring this to GraphQL, which kind of has like a bit of an overhead because it supports all these queries, it's sometimes not that worth it when you can just like you know exactly what the payload you need to construct like ahead of time. So yeah, it's hard unless your GraphQL API is like super super fast. It's rare you can like optimize as much as when you have like one specific endpoint. So that's one thing we've noticed.
Right.
I've actually taken this approach at Twitch just because we're on the API team and we have all these APIs to manage. Like Shruti mentioned, it's kind of like a lot to have so much API surface, and it seems like a good way to compress the amount of API space. But we found that the semantics of REST and GraphQL are so different. Like if you want to return different response codes, you have to do a lot of, at least when we were trying to map our new GraphQL API to our existing REST APIs, it was really, we had to do a lot of work to do that mapping because they were so different. And it was almost more work than just maintaining both kinds of APIs, you know?
Shruti, what's your experience with this? Like, did you kind of like migrate from REST to GraphQL, or did you have some kind of like GraphQL on top of REST thing for a while?
Yeah, so actually, so at PayPal, most of our underlying APIs are REST APIs. So even if you build like a GraphQL API, at some point you would end up calling a REST API. So then our GraphQL layer more or less becomes like an orchestration layer. At checkout, we have less of that, but in my previous team, which was the partners team, I was basically writing like an orchestration layer in GraphQL that was kind of like doing a one-to-one mapping of REST API. So I think I was calling like 3 different REST APIs, and then the GraphQL layer is what the client would talk to. So converting that REST into GraphQL. And yeah, like you were saying, right, like that overhead is a lot. And in my use case, what I had to do was REST would throw all these like 400 errors, for validation errors. And for me, that was the biggest use case of where this overhead comes in, because it would throw a 400 on like maybe let's say a specific field. And then in my GraphQL response, I have to show which field it is. So that like parsing that error into GraphQL's error took a lot of effort.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, like transferring errors is such a tough one, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's hard.
Such a pain.
Yeah, and that's true. And it's kind of weird, like, and that's something like a lot of people who compare REST and GraphQL, like they complain about GraphQL is like having to re-implement all these standards. So like, okay, I got a 400, I need to transfer that into my GraphQL error, which nobody does really the same. So yeah, it's hard. And that was one challenge with calling GraphQL from REST as well, is the opposite. Like grabbing GraphQL errors and then, okay, what status code should that be? And what REST error that should be? Yeah, that's hard. Were you kind of doing any automation from REST to GraphQL, or the GraphQL like aggregator you were saying, was that like manually built, the schema?
Yeah, for me, the whole schema was manually built. Whenever a field would be added in REST, I would add it manually in my GraphQL schema. So it was a bit of manual work for me. I wonder if there are like automation tools that auto build your schema.
I've seen it, because the thing with REST is like if you need to have some sort of schema in the first place. A lot of people don't, but if you use something like OpenAPI, there's a tool that does OpenAPI to GraphQL. There must be other tools for like JSON schema, I bet, and stuff like that.
Oh, I see. So it's like converting one schema into another
Pretty
schema.
much, yeah.
Oh,
But it
cool.
doesn't write like
Thanks.
all the hard stuff you mentioned, like the translation of errors, the logic, and everything. So, Donnie, you must have
Yeah.
kind of like similar problems going on because you've also got this aggregator thing and underlying service errors.
Yeah. It's something we're still kind of experimenting with. Well, the powering REST APIs with a GraphQL API, we abandoned that one because we were just like, this is too hard. So we tried it a few times. Like I think actually like 3 separate times, because it seems like it would be nice to have that, but decided it wasn't worth doing that. But for the way we call everything, we have the GraphQL as our aggregating layer. Just it's for clients. It's so they can develop their applications well. And some cases, it's bubbling up those service errors. It's kind of hard because sometimes it's like a mechanical error and it's not really something you want to show in the user experience. And it's hard to get people to think when they're designing new features and products to say, when this happens, show this to the user.
Right.
Everyone's kind of thinking like the happy path. That's the priority, right? Like you want things to work.
Yeah.
And then so like, what do you do when things don't work, and how do you handle that? I think that's a really interesting problem. But you can take like the Facebook approach and just kind of like throw everything out if you ever get an error. We're trying some experiments now to see if we can do better. Like, can we degrade more gracefully in some cases? What does that mean for the amount of work clients have to do? Actually, Shruti, like I'm interested. So I think Mark and I are more on the back end of the GraphQL stuff, and you're on the front end. Have you done any like explorations to like handling errors gracefully on the client?
Yeah, so the app that I was working on before kind of has like these, I guess you could say, levels of errors you can show. So some of them are like, for example, validation errors on the data you input in the form itself, and that we can tell you that you need to fix them. But then some of them could be like a more serious error, like you are not a valid user, let's say, and as a user you can't really do anything about it, but we as the client need to know, so we as the app need to know. So those levels we would not show. And then like it basically came down to if it's a 400 and if it's one of these validation errors, then show the user where to fix this. But if it's a 400 and it's this validation error, then hide gracefully. So just be like, oh, something went wrong.
Yeah, to me it's a little scary because you could end up putting a lot of like business logic in the client side, but I don't know if like to build a really sophisticated application, I don't know how you really get around that.
Yeah, that was one of the big troubles. Yeah.
For your validation errors, do you make those as specific like result objects in the schema, like one of those patterns that like for schema design, or do you just read them from the errors response?
So for us, the REST API would throw like it had a specific format. There would be like a status code, and then the field, and then the message. So it had those 3 fields we knew for sure. But then we constructed our error object to also show these 3. And so I think it comes out as parts of extensions. So in extension, you would have like this error object, and it would have those 3 fields. So basically, looking at those 3 fields, you could know which field you want to target.
Interesting.
It's interesting to use the extensions part of this instead of the. Some people like put that into the schema itself, but when you have underlying sources that you don't necessarily control, that's like really hard.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And then because we were combining more than one API, it was really hard to figure out like which API would be the one throwing an error.
Yeah.
But one standard thing for us is the error object that REST API throws, so status code, field, and message. So that's why we constructed our extensions object.
Yeah, makes total sense. Okay, how about we do another misconceptions? We went on a really interesting tangent, but we only got one.
Actually, speaking of that, that kind of makes me want to talk about this one. You can't have REST endpoints in your implementation with GraphQL because we already
Oh yeah,
covered this.
there you go. Yeah, so the myth is, would you say like the myth is like you can't have both? Like you need to like go from REST to GraphQL kind of thing?
Yeah, yeah. A lot of people feel that, and I think like this is mostly in an enterprise because a lot of the APIs are REST, and then usually like people would want to build everything from scratch, but then you can actually just build it as an orchestration layer. Um, and you can still keep all of your REST endpoints as is, but then your client only talks to like one GraphQL endpoint.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. Um, Even like I would even say like it's possible to have both as one API sometimes. Like there's one problem I've been thinking about, especially with GitHub in mind, is we have some endpoints that play with files, like a Git like blob or just like reading a file. And GraphQL to read a file is not that nice. Like if you have a field
Yeah.
that returns the contents of a file, that's kind of annoying. It's way better to just get an endpoint that represents that file. So like I almost feel like a totally valid API would be like a GraphQL API that returns like kind of metadata about files, but also has URL to the file contents, and you use like just an HTTP API to fetch those files. Like I think you really don't have to do like full on one thing. Like even authentication is another example where I don't know if
Yeah.
GraphQL is always that cool to use compared to just like an auth endpoint. So yeah, I agree. This is a big myth.
That's a really interesting way of solving that file problem. So your GraphQL just gives you like meta information about the file, and then one of the fields is URL. So you go fetch your URL from there. That's a really cool way of solving it.
Yeah, I've been thinking about that. We don't do that right now. I don't think so. But I think it'd be, yeah, I feel like a lot of GraphQL APIs could return URLs in general, kind of like the
Yeah,
hypermedia thing, but from GraphQL. I think it would make sense.
yeah, that's really cool.
Let's do another one. Um, Here's one I'd like to hear your thoughts about. The fact, like the backend versus front end thing with GraphQL. I think a lot of people are confused if it's like a front end technology, like because I think that's where it's most popular. Like people start with React and
Apollo
like
client.
yeah, Apollo client, and they come like there's a lot of like should I use Redux or GraphQL? Like
Yeah,
what's your answer to that? Like
yeah. I think when I started, I was also really confused whether like now that I'm using GraphQL, if I really need Redux. And I think I was using Apollo Client 1.0, so it also comes with like inbuilt cache, and it has a way of like setting everything to your cache if you want to. Yeah, my response to that usually is like Redux is like a state management library, right? So like you fetch data from API and then you put it in your Redux state and you use it whenever you want to. But then GraphQL is the API you would fetch that data from. So you could still replace your API with GraphQL API, but you still have to manage that data on your client side at some point. You could use Apollo Client for doing that. You could just use like React's native hooks and use state. Or you could use like Redux, like a complicated state management solution. I guess not complicated, depending on how comfortable you are. But yeah, like a state management solution to manage your data from the API, which then becomes a GraphQL API.
yeah, complicated for me, Redux,
Yeah.
but not for people who know about it. But yeah, like it's sometimes I wonder about that. It's like GraphQL is so popular on the front end
Yeah.
that I think that's also why like solutions to get a GraphQL like API working as fast as possible are so popular because people are so interested by it on the front end, they just want to consume it, but there's a bit less information on how to build a solid backend. So
Yeah.
like I think that's where a lot of the focus is like getting one started as quickly as possible. Like for you, let's say at PayPal, did the pressure to use GraphQL come from more like of the front end side, or was it did like both the back end and front end side agree that it was needed?
So it's really interesting. Like when I first started on the partner team is when I got introduced to GraphQL. It was kind of like, hey, this is a cool technology. Let's try it out. And we weren't even sure like if our app would be the right fit for it. It was an internal app, so we were like, we can experiment with this, and if something wrong happens, we can always roll back. We still had like a version 1 of that app, so it kind of came from that perspective. But I believe like the main goal of using GraphQL at that point was because we were orchestrating three or more APIs. We wanted to have like this uniform place where we could fetch all of our data and send it to our front end. And another reason why we wanted to use that was because we wanted to keep our front end light. So I guess it kind of came from like a optimization of the APIs we were using. Um, yeah. What about you guys?
Go ahead,
Okay,
Mark.
sure. I'm gonna go ahead. Yeah, for me, it's I guess at GitHub it's kind of like weird because because of the public API kind of thing, uh, we have this we have a lot more external consumers than internal consumers. So um,
Yeah.
a lot of the team likes thinking about like the backend side of things and trying to support like as many as customers as possible. So it wasn't. I think so. It's evolved so much, right? At the beginning, like I think some people even wanted to use GraphQL as an ORM, which you have as a myth as well in there. Now it's evolving as like just like kind of a way to interact with GitHub's domain in general as a public API. So yeah, I guess like our focus has been definitely a lot on the back end and what it can provide to us as an API provider. But of course, that extends to we want clients to be happy. What I'm excited about is like initially, it's kind of hard for like public API providers because not everybody is familiar with GraphQL as much as they are with REST. But more and more, I'm seeing just like especially with tools like Apollo Client evolving, Relay, there's such great tooling that at some point people are
Mhm.
not going. Well, that's my guess. Is like at some point, if the front end tooling is so great for GraphQL, clients will start asking, like, "Hey, PayPal, can we have like a public GraphQL API? GitHub, can I have a public GraphQL API? Because I want to use these tools. I know
Yeah.
we're probably not there yet, but it'd be nice to get there."
For us, how we got started was kind of a joint, like serendipitous effort between the API team that we had and the front end team that was like rewriting a client, the client for Twitch TV. And so this was we were like we got really overwhelmed supporting so many versions of the API, and so we're like we need an easier way to do this, and we need one way to define a certain type, and we can't have it be different. We had a very organic API growth, so GraphQL was kind of a reaction to that, and we kind of latched on to this big client rewrite effort to reduce user experience latency. So it kind of was like the API team introduced it to our clients, and they're like, "Wait, we love this." It was all downhill from
Nice.
there. Yeah.
We have a question from chat. Diana is asking, did we talk about misconception that GraphQL has to use JSON? That's true. GraphQL doesn't have to use JSON. But have you ever seen, Diana, let us know if you've seen as well, like a GraphQL API that doesn't use JSON, like that uses XML or, I know people talk about protobuf, but I've never seen that so far, but it's true.
I've never seen that either. Yeah.
Yeah.
You could use like message pack or something. I wonder if that would, but I don't know if you're gzipping everything already, maybe it wouldn't make that big of a difference.
I'm curious if it's XML, like how do you put it in your schema? How do you define schema for that?
Yeah, I guess like you would only be interested by, you need to like find the right format for it.
Yeah.
Oh yeah,
That
rejoiner.
would be really hard to put in your schema.
Yeah, I wonder what the pillow would
I'm not
look
familiar
like.
with rejoiner.
Yeah, I'll post it in the chat. Rejoiner is this it's a Google project, I think. protobuf. Yeah.
Oh, interesting.
Limited implementation of GraphQL. That's really interesting. I've always wanted to play with this. Never had the chance. Oh, so there you go. Protobuf based. Shruti, I was just talking about ORMs, and you have that as a myth. Is that one? Is that one you see a lot? Like I know I've seen it internally a lot, and I see it in terms of security as well. Like people often think, like because you use GraphQL, you've just exposed a public ORM to your data, and
Yeah.
like that's one that's kind of hard to stop actually. Like I see that so often. What would you say to people thinking GraphQL is an ORM? Like what's the difference? Because sometimes it's kind of closed, but there is a difference there.
I haven't heard that myth ever since I wrote that article. I actually took it out of the main article.
Okay.
I don't know. Yeah, like I haven't heard that much, especially at PayPal. I don't know.
Great. Yeah. I think maybe like the one that it's often put together with is just like that GraphQL needs to leak your database at the same time. And I feel like that's one that also people use to say GraphQL is not secure.
So I see. So people have a feeling that GraphQL exposes the tables that you have.
Yeah, that's one I have to fight against often on Twitter in the past. Yeah, people just think it's insecure and like I don't want to use it. I want to expose just like the things I want, and then you have to explain. That's why we build the schema.
Right. Oh, I see. So people think that whatever is in your database actually gets exposed without you having any control over it.
Right, exactly.
I see. Yeah. That's where the schema comes in.
Especially,
I think the abstraction is like that's what you want. Like it seems annoying at first, and it has a cost for sure, but keeping your interface separate from your data store is so powerful because then you can just swap it out. And man, there's like so many times in my career that I've seen it play out where if someone just didn't tie their database to some API, like you would have saved months or years of effort, which is so wild to think about, like how much time is wasted because you tie an API to your database. Yeah, damn. That's one of my pet peeves. Hey, wasting time. Too many migrations.
Okay, I want to move on, Shruti, to there's one myth you have in your article that kind of like segues into the other thing we wanted to talk about is that GraphQL is difficult to introduce in an existing project. And something else we wanted to talk about is like how to get started with GraphQL in an enterprise. I think a lot of people can be like, oh my God, that's like so much complexity I'm bringing in, so much work. So like, what are your thoughts on like getting started? Like I imagine somebody listening who has not even told anyone about GraphQL just yet. Like they want to get started from a clean state. Like what should they do?
Yeah, so I think we can talk about it in two terms, right? One is like you want to experiment with GraphQL as a side project. How can you start with that? And then the second one is how you can introduce GraphQL in an enterprise, especially like big enterprises. There's so many existing APIs already there. Let's talk about the second one first, and then we'll move on to how to get started. So I feel like in an enterprise, you kind of, so you have a project, you have a product you need to build. And then there's like, if you are an enterprise, there's like maybe already existing APIs you need to build. So one, you can start building that as an orchestration layer. So you can wrap all of your REST APIs as a layer. And then, so your client only talks to like one endpoint. Another way to start, which some people also do, is to convert one of the APIs into a GraphQL layer, especially if that is the API you have control over. So you kind of start small. The basic goal is that you start small, and then kind of see if that's advantageous to you. If GraphQL is the right tool for you, then you start converting all of your other APIs into GraphQL API.
I think it makes so much sense, like especially in a bigger company, trying to do a full rewrite or like a big project of changing everything is just like, well, very hard or maybe even impossible. There's so many like, not even technically, but like the people side of things, like the number of people you need to convince. So I think it's really good advice, like starting on something small and proving it works there and then slowly expanding.
That also helps because there's maybe some tools that you're using currently in your enterprise that don't exist in GraphQL. So you start small, you build that tool out, that's working, that's stable. So then you move on. And not only are you improving GraphQL and like you're making GraphQL endpoints, but you're also improving the tooling that you're using for GraphQL.
Yeah, one thing I've seen and I think is really interesting is the concept of like a client schema, like kind of like using GraphQL on the client side or like building a specific GraphQL API built by the front end team that interacts with the current backends. Like if you were like a front end team that wants to use it, that would seem like a cool way to like do an experiment and a prototype without affecting like existing services. Like you kind of build your own little client schema, which is kind of what you did like as an aggregator. That does really seem like a really good way to get started, and then eventually maybe these underlying services like become GraphQL themselves, but that's not needed at first.
Yeah, totally. I feel like that's such low stake, right? Like your endpoints already exist. So even if your GraphQL system fails, you just like replace them with like fetch REST APIs. So all of that system already exists. Just get rid of the schema, get rid of your queries and mutations. So that bit can already be there. That's kind of what we did as well. We had a UI design, and then we had all these like endpoints. So we could just completely like link them together. But we decided to put this GraphQL layer in between to just experiment with GraphQL. So yeah, I think that's a great approach as well. Tony, I think you were saying something.
No, I think like taking this incremental approach is such an effective way to get things done in a large organization. Like it's so different from just like starting something new. It's like even if you start something new in an enterprise, it may not be adoptable if it's not incrementally adoptable. You know, it's just so there's so much in place. There's so much momentum, and not like Mark said, it's not even the technology part of it. It's the social aspect and like
convincing back-end engineers, convincing front-end engineers, convincing your manager and your boss,
finishing before the next reorg.
Too real.
Yeah, there's it's funny to think about like all the other problems that are not technical that are sometimes way harder than to build a GraphQL server.
And I think that's why like having data on what has worked and like showing data on like, oh, we had this big payload and now it's just this. So, you know, like you have numbers that you can prove what you're saying is true. Really helps, especially when convincing your boss and their boss and leadership.
Yeah, it's such a good point. Like measuring everything and being able to show the impact of your work, even generally.
Yeah,
that's such a good point.
What would you so if you were building let's say a GraphQL aggregator, getting started, what would you measure to kind of like prove the success of this? Are you thinking like performance metrics or more like developer experience metrics?
I think both of those are great. Developer experience, performance metrics, time it takes to load, data sent over the wire, instrumentation over what data is being used.
Yeah.
True. That's a good point. Yeah, what data is being used is a huge one as well. You can actually get data, like precise data on this with GraphQL, which is nice. Like you can tell which parts of your data is not used at all, even in some cases. Yeah, I like that. So with that approach, where you start building an aggregator in front of other services, have you had any problems with who owns which parts of the schema, or like kind of like how so many people from different teams participate on that schema? Do you have the front end developers write their schema, or is it kind of like the services teams writing their part of the GraphQL schema? Yeah, if that makes sense.
That's a good point. Yeah. So as of now, we are not at a stage where we are kind of like one graph. So for example, like my previous team had its own GraphQL layer. They controlled the back end, the front end of it. So they wrote the schema. And then this team that I'm on, the checkout team, also has its own GraphQL layer, and they also control the schema. I think in this team, like there's other sister teams as well that are responsible for the same schema. So for us, the problem hasn't been that bad because we're not like one graph all over the company. But for us, it has been, oh, okay, you're going to add the schema. I'm going to create a pull request and add the collaborators on it and kind of have a discussion over it. So it's been more informal. And I know like some companies are solving that with the help of Apollo Studio. Yeah, I'm interested to know if you guys are working with one graph, if you have that kind of clash problem.
Yeah,
go for it, Tony. I think
we do. we have this. We try to make everything available through the same graph API schema, and so we have, I don't know, maybe 50 teams that contribute. So it's probably one of our largest shared projects, other than like our big clients like Twitch.tv. And one thing that we're looking at to kind of help delineate ownership better is type extensions. So you say user purchase information extends user and belongs to the commerce team or something like that. And then we actually use GitHub, and we'll do like code owners, and then we can split out into separate files and say, okay, the commerce team owns that file. So if anything happens, like grab a review from them, and they can help you out. It's been painful at times mostly when we're trying to like refactor something, like the way something works broadly across the API. We have to touch a lot of things that we don't own. Like we manage it in when we do these big migrations, but or refactors. But it's not like we don't own the business functionality for it. And there's been times where we fix a bug and the implementation was built on top of the bug. So fixing the bug actually creates a bug. And it's hard to figure out like who owns that, like who should have reviewed this to make sure that this will work. I think type extensions, we haven't gone too far in that direction yet, but it sounds like a pretty promising solution for that.
Yeah, I think the only concern I have with the type extensions and like putting schemas together sometimes is that, so like I'm not always convinced like one graph should be like everybody's like North Star, like that everybody should converge towards that, because I do think like a graph per product, like what you seems like you have, Shruti, can be nice as well, because you mentioned you don't have that problem, which is a plus in some ways.
Yeah.
One thing I'm kind of wary of is like, so let's say if PayPal had like one notion of a product, and everybody used extensions to add their field on that, sometimes you end up with like a super large product type that loses kind of its specificity in like different products. Like in theory, you might have like 5 or 6 different kind of product objects that represent different things. So not that it's impossible to do if you use extensions, you can still do that, but it seems like you'd need to be careful not to like overuse the same objects across like your whole organization. So that's true. Yeah, that's one thing to think about. But like obviously the one graph approach seems like really awesome if you can like unify, if a client can access like the entirety of PayPal or Twitch. But yeah, that's kind of like one worry I have sometimes with that.
I'm curious if you've ever had a situation where a schema already has a field like user, and then somebody else also wants to add a similar field user as well, but then it's a different kind of data. It's, I don't know, like a pro user versus a member user. Has that ever happened?
Yeah, I think so. It usually involves like kind of discussion, trying to figure out exactly what are we trying to build, and then our team does a lot of like it's like knowledge sharing of like why this was designed this certain way, and then how this could fit in that way. So maybe, yeah, it's not always like this is a clear answer. It's not always clear what the best thing to do is. It usually involves a lot more discussion, which I think is possibly one of the weaknesses of this approach, like Mark was alluding to. Yeah, it's definitely a sticking point. Naming in general is hard. Like sometimes, ambulance. Sorry. Sometimes it's like it's just the name seems similar, but it's actually a different thing, and you can just provide a better name, and that solves the problem. But if you're trying to introduce like separate concepts, like a user in this product is different from a user in this product, yeah, that's a little difficult. I think in that case, we just end up jamming it into the same thing, and then it, like Mark said, it kind of loses the specificity of the type.
Right.
Diana in chat says we keep one graph as a lib, but deploy subset of it for each front end. So one graph is available for experimentation as a starting point, but then you deploy a subset of it when you're ready on the front end. Which is I've heard of that before. So I think I know what Diana's talking about here, but I don't know if I can leak what company is doing that. But I've heard of that approach, and that sounds amazing. That sounds like such a great way to do things, because you still keep some kind of isolation in production, but you have like a whole graph to explore when developing. That's a really interesting approach.
So it's available for you if you want to consume it, but when you are adding to it, you're only adding to your own domain.
I think it's something
That's
like that,
cool.
Yeah. Question for you all. I think we were pretty much early-ish adopters of GraphQL. Do you ever feel like a kind of jealousy to people that are starting today, like knowing all this? I know that we had to figure out a lot of stuff, and we ended up doing a lot of things suboptimally, or we've gone in a certain direction where now we can't, without spending a lot of effort, get out of that direction. And we know we don't want to be there, but there's not so much of a choice. Do you feel that way? Like,
every time I see somebody using Playground, I feel so jealous. I'm like, I wish I had this when I was starting. It's so good.
I definitely feel that way as well. Like especially with a public API that you can't just change
forever
easily.
Yeah.
There's so many decisions that are like,
yeah.
Having known that, yeah.
But
yeah, it's good for people starting, that at least like there's some people that have explored in the past. It's probably good for GraphQL as a whole.
Definitely.
There's a lot of tools for the IDE as well, which weren't there when I started, which are really helpful. I was literally like copy pasting the whole schema into a string. Yeah, I think tooling has improved a lot over the last 2 years.
Do you use mainly JavaScript tooling, Shruti?
Yeah, my team does. We have Java and Go, Kotlin teams as well, which are now kind of using those tooling as well and developing some in-house as well.
Yeah, the JavaScript ecosystem is really awesome for GraphQL.
Yeah.
Tony, I'm curious what you think about that, because you've participated in the Go ecosystem a bit, and there's a few libraries there for GraphQL, but what do you think of the tooling as a whole?
In Go, I feel like it's pretty Spartan compared to JavaScript. Like the tooling there gets the job done, but it's definitely not as complete or diverse as the JavaScript ecosystem. Yeah, I'm definitely jealous of that. Like for GraphQL, the tooling is majority JavaScript, but that said, there's also tooling in I think every single other language. I know there's companies that use Rust for their stuff. We use a lot of Go. I think I've heard of someone doing Erlang. I know someone making tooling in Reason ML, which I don't know if that's actually, is it JavaScript? That's just a library on top of JavaScript? I don't know. But if there's a language, there's probably some some tooling for GraphQL in it.
Yeah.
Maybe not COBOL, but I don't know.
So Shruti, for if we go back to kind of like adopting GraphQL in an enterprise, so we mentioned like metrics are great, prototyping is great. Do you have any tips for like, because I know that's one question I hear a lot and I have no idea how to answer it, is like people want tips to talk to like their manager or their C-level team. Like, do you have like a go-to kind of elevator pitch or like a couple sentences to try to convey like GraphQL's benefits, or did you just never kind of have to do that?
So we do a lot of these tech talks at PayPal, and sometimes leadership attends them as well. So the few like go-to points we have is that our leadership cares about time it takes to ship out a product, time it takes for the product to load on the page, developer productivity, and happiness. So those are the tips we talk about. Talking about developer productivity, we can show like Playground and all these tools that are there for IDs as well. When it comes to shipping a product faster, you talk about how you have like one API and everybody's kind of talking to the same API. And then when it comes to like improving the performance of the app itself, there's things about like reduction in payload that you're sending, instrumentation over which fields are not being used, so you can get rid of them. Trying to think of other things. I think the whole thing about like you only get what you ask for is definitely a big winner, especially like if you have a REST API that kind of delivers a big payload, which in enterprises you may have like already existing APIs, and then you're kind of delivering whatever the API is requesting, is sending, regardless of what you requested. So that's another thing.
Yep. That's some awesome tricks, I think, and tips for people starting today. And I mean, it seems like, because I've always seen PayPal as a company, like they've always talked about APIs a lot, and like there's this awesome REST API style guide coming from PayPal as well that a lot of people use. So like to me, like a company like the size of PayPal and a company that cares about APIs using GraphQL already is like that seems really huge. So if it worked for you there, I'm sure it can work for a lot of people.
Yeah, one of the major problems that we have is like with versioning. So we have V1, which is completely different than V2, V3, and so on. And that's true for most teams across PayPal. And I think that's one big thing for the leadership team as well, because with GraphQL, you only have one endpoint. So your users will always have the data, no matter how many updates you push as a developer. So that's really cool.
That is really cool. And that's kind of like another myth to me that goes both sides. Is like, so like GraphQL, like a lot of people say like you don't need to version GraphQL, and that's kind of true because you can just like evolve that one endpoint. But you still need to like deprecate things sometimes, or maybe you don't if you like keep adding things. So that's the beauty of it. Like you don't add to the existing client. I'm curious, is the API mature enough that you've had to deal with stuff like deprecations and changes?
We don't have that problem yet. Again, like because we are not one graph, different teams kind of have different users. So we're not at that problem yet. But I imagine in the future, if we do come across that problem, we'll add the directive to deprecate it, and looking at the instrumentation, looking at the data and analytics we have, slowly deprecate that field out.
Yeah, that's great. We're at the top of the hour, so I don't want to take too much of your time. First of all, something I'd like to hear is a GraphQL joke you told us before we went live. If you remember it, because you're
okay. Let me open it right here.
I don't think I've ever met anyone that has a repository of jokes. This is fantastic.
Yeah, we should link that up. Actually, what's the repo? Dev jokes.
Let me drop it in the chat in Skype here.
Yeah, Shruti has a collection of dev jokes.
This was my Hacktoberfest project. Okay, so a guy ordered a pizza with cheese, olives, onion, and red pepper. On getting it, the guy shouted, "It is not baked." Delivery guy says, "You only get what you ask for."
There you go.
But
All right, Shruti, do you have anything to plug? Your Twitter, any blog?
SoundCloud.
Sure. SoundCloud. Oh, I wish I had that. Yeah, so you can follow me on Twitter at Shruti Kapoor08. I yesterday published 4 new egghead lessons on optional chaining in Node using Babel, in Chrome, and using null coalescing. Oh, that word is so hard. So you can find us on Egghead. I also tweet dev jokes on Twitter at Shruti Kapoor08.
Awesome. Yeah, everybody should follow you and check out your lessons as well. You're an amazing teacher and speaker. So thank you so much for joining us again.
Thank you so much for having me, guys.
And thanks for joining in, everyone. Thanks, Tony.